we were going to talk a little bit, I think, about maybe some. Linden, do you want to lead this, or maybe Bill would lead it? But the idea of some of the definitions that, as a learning maybe component of this conversation,
Yep,
would maybe we should dive into that a little bit.
sure. So one of the most, I think, basic ways to educate yourself is there are a lot of different terms and phrases that get thrown around that if you've been talking about race for a long time, you're like, got it down altogether. But if you haven't really thought about it, or it hasn't come up too much, or you haven't had a very deep conversation about it, you might hear something and then brush over it but not fully understand what it means, or which can lead to misunderstanding, which is a snowballs very quickly. I just have a few things written down, but uh, people of color and Black Indigenous people of color, one thing that I think is important to say is, and really at the center of this, back in a while ago, we would say colored people, and now we say people of color. And you might wonder, why do we do that? And it's about making it centric to people. So it's people of color and not colored people. It's saying that you're a person first. It's a small thing, but it does change the emphasis to people instead of color, which is sort of what we want to be seen as. Also, privilege is often a tricky one to understand, mostly because, well, before we get into this, Bill, Akeo, do you want to try to define it or go through it, or your understanding of it? Privilege, just in general?
Sure. I think privilege is, I would say, an avenue to opportunity, one which can be unconscious, although can also be conscious.
I'd say that it's the for me, like regarding just like general discussion of systemic racism in our country, it's a privilege it's a privilege to be able to not talk about it. And yeah, so I think which is why it's important to talk about these things and create discussions or foster environments where these discussions can take place, because by not talking about it, I think you're exercising your privilege.
Yeah. Privilege is just having some sort of advantage over someone, usually in the context of something you couldn't control. So white privilege is having something not done to you because you're white, or being given something because you're white. But then there are also so many different levels of privilege. There's gender privilege, there's socioeconomic privilege. Different people, they're born how they are, and that means they are automatically put in they're given some sort of restriction. Another one is race and ethnicity. Most people might know this, but just a difference is, race is usually a lump sum term, whereas ethnicity, you can be more than one. So you could be Irish Polish or Japanese American, and it's sort of more of a gradient that people can express themselves in. But with race, it's often Black, white, Hispanic, those categories. Those are the ones I have written down, but do you guys have any things you want to talk about?
The biggest thing that I think about when we talk about definitions is just simply not knowing, and how uncomfortable it can be to have a discussion when you don't know maybe the definitions, but to go into things with kind of an open mind, and also not be offended if people were to call you out, or kind of not necessarily confront, but talk to you about maybe certain words that you're using. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think a big thing is if you're in a conversation and you or hear a term that you don't know, I think it's fully fine to say, wait, I don't understand that. Can you help me understand and explain that to me? And that just furthers the sort of like teaching experience. And usually someone would be happy to break it down for you and be like, okay, here's what this actually means. Yeah. I had a document open. Can't find it now because so many different documents. But I don't know. But there are also one thing that is even more of an enigma to grasp is systematic racism. Do you guys have a concept? Do one of you want to explain it?
I mean, my understanding of systematic racism is kind of like it's inherent in our culture. Like I would consider myself, if I'm not being actively anti-racist, I am by default then a racist because I was raised and educated in a society that is founded on racism. And yeah, that's kind of my understanding of systemic racism.
Yeah, I'd add
Akeo?
that systemic racism, I mean, you look at the word systemic coming from the system that our society is built on. So governmental system and the official policies that the country was based on, the racist policies historically, some of them distantly historically and some more recent that, whether we're talking about slavery or they're looking more recently at like mass incarceration and war on drugs or voter disenfranchisement. These are systemic problems based on government policy. And that doesn't have to only be government policy. I think, as Bill was saying, then in our society, it's a society based on racism and founded on slavery. So that these elements of racism are built into our society. And so if you're not actively speaking against them or actively trying to be aware of them, you can be supporting them unintentionally.
Yeah.
You are supporting them.
Yeah, for sure. I guess one question I wanted to ask Linden was like the majority of the conversations that I've had with people are like on the side. They're not organized. Like it's kind of in passing, but I just kind of wanted to ask you what motivated you to have like a more formal discussion with your CSU teammates. And because I would have never thought to have like actually done that and sat down as a group and had that conversation. And I just was wondering like what motivated you to do that, and how do you like, yeah, I guess.
I guess it was really two things. The first is that I really wanted to just get everything out there because I don't think there's ever been a time where sort of talking on the side or just kind of whispers and murmurs has really led to any sort of big change. I think really just addressing it like, hey, this is an issue, let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And giving people that space, but also like letting everyone's uncomfortability, letting all their like feelings come out is important because that's showing you that you care, because if you feel uncomfortable and you feel maybe a little embarrassed or ashamed, it means you're able to recognize that maybe what you've done is wrong, which is an indicator that you can change. And I like to think that it's the people who are so afraid of being wrong or admitting that they're wrong that are helping perpetuate this. But and a second, the other motivation behind it was, I think in the ski world, a lot of the initial talks that happen when we talk about race and making skiing more diverse is about making skiing more diverse, bringing in different socioeconomics people into it, bringing different racial groups into it. And I think that is amazing. And I think it is necessary for skiing to persist in the modern world. And it seems silly to limit our talent pool to a smaller group. Like the bigger you can make it, the faster skiers you're going to find. But that really is an administration issue and a long systemic issue that goes back generations. I think we all know who, when we ski, you don't really get into skiing by accident. You know someone who skis, whether it's a family member or a friend. And so what I really wanted to impart on my teammates was that in this sheltered environment, the white privilege you talked about, it gives people the sort of ability to let their guard down, and maybe their biases or even more racist tendencies may come out. And I'll talk to my own experience about this, but I notice at ski races or at practices, especially when I'm in a place where maybe there isn't a lot of diversity, I'll notice a distinct change in people when I come around. Race is never talked about, but then other times I've been around a corner or something, or just out of sight, and I've heard racist marks and disparaging marks or remarks about stuff. And I really think that in the presence of just white people, people who will make those jokes and remarks, they feel like it's okay because no one's going to report them. No one's going to tell them to a person of color. And I really wanted to make everyone see that you have the ability to stand up, and if you hear something, if you see something, say something. It's that sort of thing. You as a white person, you live in a distinct advantage and a position where you are able to, from the very base of where racism comes from within white communities, help stop it there, really nipping it at the root. And that's really what I wanted to impart on everyone. Yeah, so that was my motivation for that racial conversation.
Nice. And one question I want to ask Akeo, you've been skiing professionally for